Mass protests continue across the United States for the sixth consecutive night. This is over the killing of an unarmed black man, George Floyd, at the hands of a white police officer in Minneapolis. Let's get you first the latest on what's happening on the ground. At least 40 American cities have imposed a curfew, with the National Guard being called in 15 states. More than 2,564 people have been arrested in over 12 American cities. This is over the weekend alone. Protesters continue to demand for all the officers involved in George Floyd's killing, to be charged. Currently, only one officer, who was the one seen kneeling on Floyd's neck, has been charged with third-degree murder. First, to Washington, D.C., a nighttime curfew was imposed, with the Washington mayor calling for the National Guard to support the police personnel. Protests were focused in the center of the U.S. Capitol, just a few blocks away from the White House. Large fires were seen, with the police firing tear gas and pepper spray to clamp down on the protesters. Protests, however, still gathered momentum in front of the White House. In Boston, protesters gathered as part of a peaceful rally at the Massachusetts State House. Police in riot gear were even seen using tear gas and smoke bombs, which some protesters then attempted to hurl back at the officers. In California, the governor, Gavin Newsom, has declared a state of emergency in Los Angeles County. Thousands of protesters took to the streets of LA to express their anger. Over 530 people were arrested after the protest turned violent in downtown LA. On the other side of the coast, in New York, protesters staged a peaceful demonstration. This was at Times Square. But this is just one part of the story and what's unfolding on the ground. In a complete sharp contrast, mobs of people rampaged down the sidewalks, smashing into numerous luxury shops in Manhattan's Soho neighborhood. In Denver, meanwhile, a protester was shot with a pepper pellet while filming the police at a scene of protests. In Colorado's capital, thousands of protesters were seen lying face down with their hands behind their backs, chanting, "I can't breathe." Those were among the last words, remember, used by George Floyd. In Minneapolis, where the protest started, horrific scenes were witnessed as a tanker truck drove into protesters, the police saying that the driver was inciting the peaceful protesters and instigating violence. It is still unclear whether anyone was seriously injured in that incident. Meanwhile, 2 Atlanta Police Department officers have been fired after a video showed them using excessive force against 2 college students. The officers were filmed in downtown Atlanta, where they can be seen breaking the car windows. The officers then yanked the woman out of the car. Take a look at what happened.
Open it! No, I don't know what's going on. Okay, stop the car! Stop! Stop! Okay, I'm getting out! Stop! 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 I'm getting out!
In Washington, D.C., the president continues to avoid the public eye. In fact, reports say as the protests came close to the White House, the U.S. president used the White House bunker. He spent nearly an hour inside the bunker, which was designed for use in emergencies like terrorist attacks.
My fellow Americans, I believe the White House to announce a major breakthrough for
And joining us on the broadcast this minute is our correspondent Simon Marks from Washington, D.C. Simon, extremely disturbing scenes being witnessed in several parts of the United States. If you can get our viewers a better sense of what the situation is looking like on the ground in Washington, D.C.
Well, there's a massive cleanup operation underway here in Washington, D.C. After those protests last night, the mayor has announced that the curfew here tonight will begin at 7 o'clock in the evening. Last night, it was supposed to begin at 11. They didn't have very much luck imposing the curfew then. I suspect they're going to have not much luck imposing the curfew earlier at 7 o'clock in the evening tonight. But I must tell you that President Trump, in the last hour or so, has had a very contentious telephone call with the governors of America's 50 states, in which he's called for a massive increase in the amount of security personnel being deployed here in Washington and in other states across the country. He tells them, you have to dominate. If you don't dominate, you're wasting your time. They're going to run you over. You're going to look like a bunch of jerks. He says Washington was under very good control, but we're going to have it under much more control. He threatens to pull in thousands of additional security personnel. He tells the governors, you've got to arrest people. You have to track people. You have to put them in jail for 10 years, and you'll never see this stuff again. Of course, that's not the way the legal process works here in the United States. And the president says that he is very concerned about the way in which these scenes are being viewed around the world. He says the United States looks like a pushover, and we have all the resources. It's not like we don't have the resources, so I don't know what you're doing. That is the message of the President of the United States to America's 50 governors today. A recording of that telephone call obtained now by at least 2 news networks here in the United States, and one participant in the call, I think we can infer a Democrat governor somewhere in the country, described the president's mood as being unhinged during the course of that telephone call. So very nervous hours now lie ahead for the United States. Most previous presidents of the United States, faced with uprisings and protests of the kind that the country is now seeing, would make a televised address to the nation, saying that he respects the rights of peaceful protesters to exercise their First Amendment constitutional rights to demonstrate, but also calling for an end to criminality and urging people to soothe some of their inflamed passions. There is none of that coming from this White House today. The president hunkered down, waiting for a 7th night of protests all over the country, a 4th night of protests here at the White House, and he seems to be in a very angry mood indeed.
Right, and as the protests even inched closer towards the White House, Simon, the president actually spent about an hour inside the bunker there, which is usually used for extreme emergencies like terrorist attacks.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, to my knowledge, it hasn't been used since the September 11th attacks of 2001, when the Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice and I believe Vice President Dick Cheney were both moved into the bunker at the White House. You'll remember that George Bush on that particular day was making a trip to Texas when the al-Qaeda attacks on America occurred. President Trump may have been taken to the bunker on a second occasion. Certainly Secret Service officials appear to have been very nervous on Friday night, the first time that he was escorted down there, about the possibility of demonstrators breaching the perimeter of the White House and physically assaulting the building itself. I think it's important to underscore, you see the White House on television, I mean, there it is behind me, and you think it's this big compound. It's actually a very small compound. It's not a large piece of territory. So there is evident nervousness at the White House about the possibility of protesters trying to scale the security fences that run around the building. White House staff today have all been told to stay home. This is described as an extreme teleworking measure by the White House, and any staff heading to the building were advised to hide their White House credentials, not wear them around their necks as they traditionally would, and not show them to anyone until they got to a Secret Service checkpoint where they would be allowed inside the building. Such is the anger and the risk that exists in and around the White House at the moment. And again, a country that is a tinderbox at this point. Any spark can set off further acts of violence in further cities, is not hearing a soothing message directly delivered to Americans by the President of the United States.
Absolutely, and all this unfolding while the country deals with the pandemic. We're going to leave it there for the moment. Simon, thanks very much for joining us with those perspectives and inputs. Now, as we said, multiple instances of mass looting also reported from across the United States. And this has given cannon fodder to the conservative voices who have been trying to discredit the protests since day one. People can be seen barging into shops and emerging with boxes of expensive merchandise. 2 Nike stores were looted in Rochester and Michigan. An Apple store was looted in Washington, D.C., and an Adidas outlet was targeted in Manhattan. Many of these companies have in fact offered their support to the protesters. In most cases, the protesters have nothing to do with these incidents. It's mostly these incidents and these acts are mostly being carried out by miscreants and fringe elements who are using the situation to their advantage. But for conservative politicians and commentators, looting and protesting are 2 sides of the same coin. A prime example of this attitude is the president himself. Donald Trump called the protesters thugs, quote unquote, and threatened to start shooting the looters. His outrageous tweet was ultimately flagged by Twitter. An angry group of protesters was attempting to loot a retail store, but protest organizers rushed to the front of the store and stopped things from escalating. Companies like Apple have decided to shut down their stores over fears of looting. Protesters have tried to distance themselves from such incidents. Many have also condemned the looting in the strongest possible terms.
If you were silent about your pain, they'll kill you and say you enjoyed it.
Enough is enough. We're people, we're all the same, and we need to be treated the same.
All these voices are here is because the same thing keeps happening over and over again. It's the new lynching.
Not only fighting for justice for George Floyd, we're fighting for a police-free future.
But I'm here, and I'm willing to fight, and I hope more people are as well.
Why do we threaten you so much? What is your problem? You know, this is what I want to know. Just leave us alone. Leave us to be.